In this video, I'm going to discuss the psychology of aesthetics, more specifically the issues in aesthetics relating directly to problems in general psychology and philosophy too. So the questions are, what is aesthetic value? Do the arts provide knowledge? And is there a special kind of aesthetic experience or aesthetic perception? And there's also another underlying kind of selfish reason for me choosing this topic, and that's how can I make designs that are aesthetically pleasing that I can sell for my brand, Stevia. So I'm going to examine these questions through two psychologist lenses and their books. So the first book I'm going to examine is entitled "Experiencing Art in the Brain of the Beholder," and it's by Author P. Shimamura, a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and a blogger at Psychology Today. He put aside an early interest in photography and art when he became a scientist, and later he reintegrated those interests into his current focus on the brain, photography, and art history. So I read passages from his book, and from what I got from it was, well, first, what makes things aesthetically pleasing? So things are aesthetically pleasing because they have proportions aligned to canons, which were described back then as having divine ascendance, and held expressions of natural norms. This is that they appeared natural, realistic, proportional, and fit, thus pleasing to the human eye. So design and architecture have origins that date back to the start of humanity, and was taught to artists and sculptors. It was later theorized by Greek philosophers that aesthetic pleasures derive from the correct use and appreciation of proportion and composition, which they believed had clear relation to the creation of God and gods. So most things not made directly by a human hand are aesthetically pleasing, even to people with little to no knowledge in art or natural science, such as trees, mountains, landscapes, even like the ideal human body itself, or like a dog. So artists need to be able to grasp such norms, be it rationally or just instinctively, and apply them to their work, if they want people to like their work. So that's essentially how an artist would be able to present their work so the viewer may find it innately pleasing. My psychologist later went on to explain how some of these canons, or accepted rules, were then later explained and reproduced mathematically as numeric proportions, which could be used as a formula to recreate said qualities. A common proportion still taught today is the gold ratio, or 1 to 1.6818, where 1.618 dot 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 is a very recurrent geometric constant in universal human symbols like flowers, trees, sea animal shells, and many more. Also related to the golden ratio are the Fibonacci spiral and the golden rectangle, and amongst others. So what my psychologist did not explain, or perhaps he did, but I was just not able to read it because there's only a certain section online, was that he didn't really connect on why these traits of proportion and composition made us feel pleased, besides just saying that it was the norm found in nature, which I don't think is enough because I think there has to be like more like uh, of a reason that they make us feel pleasurable. But I can kind of assume that what he means is in evolution, or in evolutionary psychology, some theories suggest that beautiful things are pleasing for the same reason that chocolate is pleasing. It stimulates the parts of the brain that evolved thousands of years ago, and so places and scenes that were healthy for our ancestors are pleasing because they provided an evolutionary advantage to our ancestors, which is why we find landscapes like very beautiful, for example. This theory does not explain everything, though, about aesthetics, but it's an interesting theory to consider. Again, being able to appreciate forms as being able to identify divine ascendance or some sort of superior trait may be subject to anyone's judgment. Modern art teaches that mathematical proportions and forms found in nature by themselves do not grant immediate acceptance, since culture has evolved to a state where viewpoints can hold individual or collective truths, and any truth is likely to be questioned, like we learned in our challenge and change class, and the documentary that you made me watch about the truth and truths. Um, and second book and psychologist I'm going to reference is titled "The Aesthetic Brain: How We Evolved to Desire Beauty and Enjoy Art," and it's written by Anjan Chatterjee. He's an expert in neurology and cognitive neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania, and he also serves on the editorial boards of 9 journals on related topics. He traces how each of the areas of okay, so basically, in the book, he focuses on uh, the things that bring us pleasure, areas of human interest like food, sex, art, uh, and how they may affect the brain. So visual art is the main one Chatterjee covers, and he focuses on aesthetic encounters rather than the creativity involved or behind the making of art. In the book, he describes four distinct sources of pleasure that cause something to be considered aesthetically pleasing. So the first source is intellectual engagement. So something like an automobile. Yeah, it's beautiful because it's graceful and economically fulfills its function. So the beauty a thing has is based on 3 variables. One, the amount of complexity. Two, uh, one, the amount of complexity and quantity of parts. Two, the integration and interconnection of these parts. And three, the gracefulness and lack of arbitrary features that impede its purpose. So how simple can it be? So the more complex, specialized, and efficient a thing is, the more beautiful we find it. This is the beauty that people find in machines and biological organisms, and it's an example of this can be like to a limited degree a well-shaped spoon, like a spoon that's perfectly rounded and for scooping, like can be seen as aesthetically pleasing to some people because it fulfills its function so well. So the second source of pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, is emotional expression. So this is made by contrasting patterns whose forms are emotionally charged. So different combinations of color, lines, texture, and musical notes have emotional associations with them because they replicate the physiological response of emotions. So if these are juxtaposed and contrasted with each other, more complex uh, emotions may be expressed. And these emotions may be recalled and manipulated in subtle ways. So contrast also emphasizes the distinguishing features of patterns and prevents the mind from becoming numb to them. So they still stay exciting in our minds, and this is why like we get bored of the same like melody that we hear on like popular music. Uh, it's just not exciting to our brains. This aesthetic is most prominent in music, but it can also be seen in like decorations, for example. Sorry. Number three, the third source, is expressing a lifestyle. So objects can be beautiful because they express a particular culture, environment, or lifestyle that we are either familiar with or wish to have. The objects simply look like something from the world that we wish we live in. Neuschwanstein Castle is the purest example of this aesthetic in architecture. It's very grand and luxurious, and this form of beauty is commonly found in literature, drama, and cinematography as well. Um, an object often acquires this aesthetic with age. So, like the castle I mentioned, it's beautiful to us not only because it's so luxurious and something that we kind of want. I mean, it doesn't really apply to modern day because we don't want castles, but it's still something that's like a symbol of luxury. And it could also be aesthetically pleasing because it's old, and over time it just developed this aesthetic. Then the fourth and final source of aesthetic pleasures is biological. So this is the innate reaction to a particular stimulus. It's it's a very uncommon way to make aesthetic judgments because usually this causes people to dismiss something as repulsive rather than to praise its beauty. So this can be identified when people personify objects. So they call like a house cute or a table aggressive. This is almost the sole source of pleasure from the culinary arts. Like the other arts is assisted by contrast. And so those are the four sources of pleasure that my psychologist claims to cause things to be aesthetically pleasing in simple terms. And yeah, and so for the criticism, so for the one criticism I have with the psychologist's viewpoint is with the third source he pointed to, which was expressing a lifestyle. In this point, he says how an object can acquire this aesthetic with age. However, this seems insufficient because I can argue that the novelty of something may also make it aesthetically pleasing, like the newness of a new sports car. And also, he never touches on why it is that this aesthetic may come with age. Like, why is it that an older castle is more aesthetically pleasing? It doesn't really touch on that. Otherwise, I very much liked his analysis, and I felt it more informative than the first book. I learned a bit about the ways humans innately feel about the presentation or design of things and the categories in which they are separated into.